Going live, you're live. It might be live. Okay. I sorry. I had typically done rebuttal videos so far, I guess, and this is mostly that. And I typically try not to kind of just restate other people's content word for word or whatever. But this one I will be doing a little bit more of that than usual because I don't have just automatic critiques of everything they have to say, but I still have to introduce the material somehow. So without being, a total plagiarist, but, wanting to cover some of the same topics. Like I don't go into as much depth on some topics as they do. So my preamble before we actually get into the video. Well, I'm kind of critiquing 3 videos this time, actually. Excuse me. And so, instead of some screenplay ones or whatever, in the one video, the guy said, or maybe it was the thumbnail, I forget, or it was kind of the premise, and her start-off point was that writing is, this soul-crushing experience, and my counter to that is that writing is actually not soul-crushing so much. It's the publishing is, either you're pretty good at writing or you're not, either you produce a fair amount of work or you don't, right? Whether you can polish a turd or a 3/4, done draft is kind of a separate thing from, getting professionals to read and determine your sale worth or your, value versus marketability and all that kind of thing. So I think I've talked about this before. I don't necessarily fall into the category of the writing is fun kind of thing will, always get you to the finish line or whatever. But it's not always the worst place to start. If writing isn't fun on any level, then why are you doing it? Unless there's, a firearm in your head involved, there's not a significant reason to want to do it. And so if, the publishing part, it just seems that they don't like anything you do. This isn't meant to be a demotivational video either, like, we'll just quit. But maybe you do need to rethink your strategy or your story or whatever it is that you're submitting, or maybe you're submitting to the wrong people entirely, which is, something they address in those expensive writers' books that people used to buy every year, even though you only needed, maybe this much of it, but you got this whole big brick full of agents that will never represent you because you don't have a contact. You're not solicited. You're not getting. You can mail them letters all you want, and you're not getting anywhere. But having said that, and what I was going to say at the beginning, but it's pretty close to the beginning anyway. The thing I have with these other content creators is I really wish they would, instead of just posting videos to one endless playlist, if you could please group by playlist, categorically where your videos should be. Now, I haven't done that because I only have like 5 writing videos and only 3 people have watched, 4 of them or something. But maybe someday down the road, I'll have to do that a little bit more. But again, mine are more kind of rebuttal videos anyway, so they're all in kind of the same boat for now. But I did separate some into the screenplay category to help the screen people a little bit more than this is more of a newer aspect of the channel, so I don't have a ton of bookworm content to begin with. Sorry, everything's backwards on my camera when I fidget. But yes, I especially wish that they would divide this into 3 segments, so you're not a beginning writer watching videos that are just wasting your time, not because they're bad videos, but because they're in the wrong segment for where you are in your journey or what you need. So the 3 stages then that are the most helpful, that I'm going to break this down, and this will, become excuse me, more relevant as we go. What they, the planning stage, your outlining and your, not necessarily synopsis, but your, like, your thesis, your plot, whatever, all that, your characterizations, all that kind of stuff, everything that you do before the actual writing. And then the second stage being the actual writing. And then the third stage, not necessarily the final stage, but the third stage for, most of these videos, the revising stage, right? Revision can be multiple stages, but again, those videos should all be categorized together. So they're easier to find. If I'm already done with my book and I need specific advice on revision, I don't want to wade through 300 titles hoping to find that one. It would be nice to know that I can just go there and see if any of those thumbnails match up with my specific needs. And then, but then when we're talking about revision, again, the distinction between the writing and the publication is that, the query and then the publisher, they will want actual changes that you maybe hadn't thought of in your previous drafts as a writer. And then a lot of those videos will discuss that, but not in super detail because they don't know what changes those publishers might want. They're not reading that mind. They're just informing you that this can happen, which it can. Okay, so what I think I have found reading comments, however, of videos that pertain to one of these stages is that a lot of these newbie questions would kind of answer themselves later because they're still in the planning stage and they haven't really asked, or I mean, I'm sorry, they haven't really started the writing, but they're asking revision topic questions and kind of and a lot of these videos, again, not being specific that this, might be a better video to watch later. They're overburdening the process for the newbie or helping the newbie overburden their own process, however that might work, chicken and the egg, I don't know. So instead of doing the nuts and the bolts, finishing the planning first, doing the writing first, you're complicating everything rather than just like, letting the machine hum and, and then later giving it a tune-up or whatever kind of metaphor I was going to attempt there that I messed up by reading the sentence poorly. So then the next thing, of course, was, and I had talked about this already in my writers group video a bit, finding beta readers and then also character thoughts. It's kind of I don't know if I meant thoughts about characters or I think that was a video about the thoughts the actual characters are having. Oh yeah, that comes in later. Okay, never mind. Thoughts. Okay, when we were discussing writing groups and beta writers and things, one of the videos was saying make sure you get quality readers, which of course can be difficult, especially if you can't afford to pay people or you don't want to pay people or you don't know what people to pay. So the basic advice was kind of rule of thumb-ish. If you have 5 readers and one of them disagrees, you as the author have to decide if you're going to go majority rule, these 4 are probably more right than this one outlier, or is this one person, though, a more qualified opinion than the rest of the masses? Should I change my ending based on these 4 who, 3 of them mostly agree and then one's kind of even an outlier of the outliers or kind of thing? Or should I listen to this guy who I respect because I've read their stuff or whatever? Stuff like that. And when you're, again, typically younger, you have a wider audience that you can reach. You can find 10 people to read your stuff maybe, whereas when you're older, you're lucky if you can find 2 or 3, blah, 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 blah. We're not going to go all into that. Character thoughts. Yes. Okay. Here where we have show versus tell a smidge. So this was inside a video. that's slightly off the topic from publishing now, but the point of this, like I said, this is kind of a blend of things video. So jumping around slightly, but based on how they were jumping around. So don't sue me. But part of it was, show versus tell a smidge. But my main issue with how to show character thoughts, and some of it was omniscient and some of it was first person and some of it was that, is basically consistency. That's the key, right? And so if you're going to do it, almost always do it the same way through the entire story would be my catch-all rule for that, rule of thumb again. Again, the advice that they were giving is also more of a necessary strategy during revision to spot where tense and other things are jumping around and might seem like they're better for sometimes maybe a whole other book than the one that you're working on, almost, because they're coming out of left field. But worrying about this while you're still doing your first draft, no, get it down, get the draft complete before anything. Again, for the newbies, they should really understand this, especially when they're now, if you're on the second or third draft and you're trying to polish it for querying, right, that's where all this stuff should be consistent already. And so in the next video, like I said, I'm not going to refute a lot of this, but I am going to go into it, even though that will make this video a bit longer, so daunting for you to watch more than 20 minutes again, if you're one of the 3 who watched 2 minutes before. But the question was, why is my manuscript being rejected? And so, 1, is my hook compelling, story premise strong versus just execution, conflict and stakes. And I talked about this in the previous video already. Anyway, I had a whole video about raising the stakes and all that. Differentiating factor that makes your story worthwhile from other similar stories, because they're all out there, and we're saying that what's copyrightable is not necessarily your idea, but your execution was from, I think, a 3rd video or a 4th video at this point, but they all agree with each other on most of these things. 1 enticing sentence is your thesis that you can tell to people. There was some metaphor about aging screenwriter versus aging screenwriter finds TikTok fame or whatever. They kind of make it into a joke, but it's true at the same time. Going back to the film thing that I may or may not have mentioned in a previous video, a long time ago, I was on a bit of a car ride with an old friend, and he was trying to write a screenplay. And we were going to visit with a buddy of his that he thought might be a financier, potentially, for an independent film. And I was in the car, not having read the script, and just having him doing what, like, if you ever saw The Player, they go to the table and they set this scene. Oh, the candles lighting up the face of the mourning women and all this. If you know the movie, you know what I'm talking about. And the guy's like, "Ooh, that's good, right?" Like, this is what producers want to hear, I guess, maybe. And I don't know how accurate that was for Hollywood or whatever. It's irrelevant. But so he started doing that. He started telling me this elaborate thing that he had already thought up. Whether or not he had written it down, I don't know. And I was like, "But what's it about?" And he's like, "What do you mean, man? It's like, there's umbrellas and I'm like, "No, but what is it about? What?" And he just thought I was being a jerk. And I said, "No, your friend, you're asking him for a ton of money. He's a finance guy. He's going to want to know, what is the movie about? He doesn't care about this and this and this little details, of your directorial vision or whatever. He wants to know from start to finish what is going to happen in this movie and why is it a compelling story? Okay, so you as the writer have to know that. And finally, I was able to nail it down out of him what the actual plot was that he had never actually defined for himself before. This, like I said, is a very common problem. Okay, so yes, make sure so that. Okay, so that's my little addition to their point. Again, I'm not disagreeing with that point. Okay, not entirely anyway. Not enough to go into it. Right. Okay. 2, have I worked on my craft? And the advice here was watch videos like this, meaning theirs, not mine, but watch mine too, or instead. Well, maybe not instead. I don't know. Whatever. Writing workshops, again, those can be hit and miss. Depends on the quality of the other participants, where you're finding these workshops, how much you're paying for these workshops, if you're getting your money's worth, blah, blah, blah. Reading craft or how-to books. I did a whole whole video about how-to books versus other self-help books. But those were more about, well, not only, but a lot of those are typically like psychology books, but technically in these creative spheres, they are self-help books. They may or may not be supplanted by videos now. I mean, if you don't want to spend the 20 or 30 bucks on the book, can you find enough content on YouTube to tell you what the book tells you? Probably, but again, you might have to wade through a lot of extra videos that you didn't really need to watch because they don't have anything to do with, again, your step in the process yet. And reading other fiction, of course, is always the piece of advice that comes up. Well, yes and no. It depends on, if you're trying to do a very genre-specific thing, but then they said read classics and recent bestsellers, read inside and outside your specific preferred genre. Yes, okay, maybe. I don't think you always have to be all inspired by some particular literary source or whatever to have an idea and, again, get that first draft down, though. But you should be kind of familiar with, actual examples of real writing that have been published maybe at some point. But for the point of this discussion, it's not the end all be all, right? So 3, is the story emotionally moving? Is it a powerful reading experience from beginning to end? Again, if you haven't gone back and established that hook, then I guess this won't matter, but this stems from that rather than restating that. Does that make sense? This is more about your actual craft of writing versus your craft of story plotting. Okay, so one is a little bit more the outliney stage, and then this is a little more the execution stage. So we're going from one to the next. Oh, and I forgot. I skipped in the previous. Have I worked on my craft? Well, now we're in the revision stage, looking back on the craft stage. So we're kind of going out of order anyway. But like I said, this is from another video. But pacing, character development, and a satisfying ending. That's your job as a first or second draft for sure. Okay. So is the story emotionally moving? Is it a powerful reading experience? Yes, I wondered how exactly they were going to tie up all the storylines on the show Lost in the finale, and then they just didn't at all. It was a waste of 2 hours, but those directors and actors and writers all still cashed their checks and went on to the next show, right? That was the example given, was how so many of us viewers were disappointed, and that's kind of a generational reference almost, because there are plenty of young writers now who will have never heard of the show Lost. So there's that, but it's still a relevant enough reference, we hope. Let's see, make audience care about characters and their journey, and that the ending pays off. Strong equals inevitable and genius. Strong writing, I guess, or strong ending. where the ending seems inevitable. I don't always agree with that. I think you can have an unpredictable ending and have it work. Talk about that in a second. Cathartic experience, yes, that you know, especially if it's a romance novel, right? There should be some action in the pants. Right? Happy or in the heart. Is the ending happy or sad or even open-ended, yet complete? That, yes, again, being the goal, and like Lost, where they just sort of, they didn't quite leave a completely open-ended ending, but they kind of wanted you to draw your own conclusion. And most people kind of drew the same conclusion, but then we're still like, but then why this? But then why that? But then why? So that was the issue. Is your ending true to your story? Not like Pretty in Pink, right? Talk about a generational reference, but they rewrote that ending to make it more palatable to teenage girls or something. And all those writers and directors and producers still all and actors still cashed their checks and went on to the next one. And I've talked about Pretty in Pink in a previous video before too, also as well, about plot holes and things. So if you go back through the screenplay playlist, you'll find it. Diagnose with reverse outline. This is a big thing for this particular creator. They love this reverse outline. So after you've done your planning stage and made up your initial outline and written your book, you should go back and redo a reverse outline, I guess, to see if your revision outline matches your initial outline. And that will help you spot plot holes and errors and things. I've never really done that. So maybe it works, but again, I guess it will depend on how much you've deviated from your outline. Now, as in writing, and I've meant to mention this, or I maybe have mentioned this at least once. I think I mentioned it in a previous video. The choices, and I know I mentioned part of this. When you come to those forks in the road, where your character needs to do this to make the story work, but in your head you're wondering what if, I say go ahead and write the what ifs, but then don't include them in the story. You know, put them aside, use them for a different thing. Because if you're really, really, really stuck on this idea and you don't get it down, you might lose it and you might regret that. Now, it depends on how long you spend on that versus how long you spent on this, because I've talked about that too, where most of us work on more than one project at a time, though, and it's not the end of the world. Because they always say, give yourself space before you go back and revise. Well, this is what I'm doing when I'm giving myself space, is I'm working on this other thing. So a lot of times I'm poaching and cutting and pasting, and I've talked about this before. Anyway, so you can literally have a whole timeline of these what ifs that don't add up to any specific ending, and they're all disjointed and in a separate folder or whatever. But they're not outlined. You know, I would be very hard pressed to make an outline for them. And again, most of them are going to be deviations from whatever original outline I have that's taking me from plot A to plot B to plot C to ending, you know, Z. You might not have 26 plot points, but you know what I mean. So that is a thing. But as you revise, you may have added things to your outline in the what she addresses in the form of subplots or secondary storylines and things, and says, you know, are those resolved? Which again, in Lost, none of those were resolved. Like one of them was resolved, maybe, if we're lucky, if I remember correctly. You know, like there were so many. I was like, how are they going to fix this in an hour or 2 hours? And they just never did. They just abandoned the idea and did whatever they wanted. And everybody was like, huh, I could have done anything else with a Sunday evening than watch this, you know. Or I could have TiVo'd this and gone to that party with that girl that hated me. You know, whatever. So then now we're again in the revision beta reader stage. Have I taken editorial feedback to heart? Or maybe we're even in the query stage at this point. Again, it depends on if they're people you trust, or, are beta readers, more dispassionate and less in your friend group. And they're a little more objective. I don't know. Again, pay to play. Depends on your finances, depends on those resources. Obviously, again, a skilled writer is mostly a better source, but if somebody just likes to read a lot, they're going to know if they like your writing too, right? Depending on what they like to read. If they only like to read horror and you give them a romance, you might have a little trouble, or vice versa. If they only like romance and anything gory turns them off, then they're not going to finish reading your book or give you very good critique other than you should write something prettier, Okay, so again, their point number 5, last point. Do I feel confident in my story? Is it ready to query? Well, we'll see. Again, we're kind of jumping around a lot, but the premise here was, am I proud of this effort? Which is actually addressed more in my next video part. So I'm kind of skimming through here. What feels unresolved or what unsure about? Again, this is not when you're going from second or third draft. This is when you're literally trying to get an agent. So they want you to write down stuff that might be stuff, that asks and answers these questions. You may or may not need to do that, again, depending on how well you know your own material, how good you think the revision is, what any of your beta readers might have said. Look at past feedback and double check that those issues have been resolved. Yes. Now, again, if you had a reader who didn't just say, I don't like fantasy books, and actually said, okay, I don't want to know why you made your dragons all green or whatever, and they've asked these kind of more serious questions. Why does the guy want to run around with, chasing high school kids with a machete? Is it just because he's insane? That kind of thing. Does he have a, real reason or whatever? And why does this girl go for that guy instead of that guy? That might be a big one. Is it just his money in his sports car, the way he dresses? Does there seem to be any deeper motivation? Then we come back here to take a break. You've done your revisions. Look at it from fresh eyes before you try to look at it again. And the other video guy says, in this case, often just having reread your own writing too much, you're familiar with it, so you don't know if it's good or not anymore. That's definitely a true thing that can happen. But again, if we've gone from the only us reading it to the beta reading it stage, we should have less of that problem now that we're revising it again after we're taking these comments to heart before we try to send it to people who can get us published. Okay. Substantial, and then here she makes the distinction, substantial changes versus minor tweaks. Yes. Okay. Are we are we rethinking the entire foundations of certain chapters or even the whole premise? Again, does the woman who's supposed to be madly in love with this guy come off as totally shallow and stupid when we look back through it or whatever? Or, does this madman need better motivation after all when we put our backstory against the actual story or whatever, all those kind of things. The point here, though, was that if your thing does not need these substantial changes and you're only obsessing about minor tweaks, you might be getting in your own way of getting it out there to actual agents or publishers. Because, yes, you may have been ignoring larger issues, but you may also just be procrastinating submission. Okay. Again, if you're watching this video, you're probably not there yet. But again, these questions should answer themselves to a great degree as you go if you are a newbie. So you shouldn't be worrying about whether or not you're procrastinating submission if you're still procrastinating planning or writing. Okay. So what stage are you really in? And have you done that reverse outline? So is it not 100% great, but as good as it can be for possibly for an agent before, again, they might ask you for revisions. And even if you do those revisions, then a publisher might ask you for revisions. That's down the road. Okay. Don't be worrying about that before you've written chapter 3. Okay. Or outlined chapter 3. But you don't always have to work from an outline again. That was another reason why the reverse outline might be helpful, because if you never worked from an outline and you wrote only from the seat of your pants, then you might want to figure out if you do have any concrete structure. And if not, then revise from that. Okay. So here's the video, 5 things that won't improve your writing. So again, we're going to hopefully be able to get through this in about 10 minutes or less. It shouldn't be too bad. I don't remember. And oh no, I didn't. That'll have to be a separate video. Okay. So this is literally 5 paragraphs and however much I ramble. Okay. And some of it is circular, again, because they put the cart before the horse, or I have to address the thing that was the thing. So in the first segment of this video, the 5 things, the first thing, I don't think the cutting thing became, the argument here was the danger of taking the advice, cut everything when revising, get it stripped to the bone, and and your writing can then become too sparse or whatever. I think the cutting thing became rote because so many newbies fall in love with all their own words more often than not. And that's different than, someone who writes a totally sparse style already. If you're already pretty Spartan, then yeah, there's probably not much to cut, much less, and maybe you're not adding enough color and drama and detail to your thing. And I would say if that's true, you're like in a 2% category or something. There's almost none of you that write books like technical manuals, and the ones who do will probably never understand why they're not getting published, because it's not prose, it's not enjoyable. It doesn't have to be poetic, but it does have to be literary. Does that make sense? Okay. If I meet someone who fits that bill in any classes I have taken and such, I would likely recall their name right now. Like I said, it's a 2%er thing. Now, this is not counting people who don't understand storytelling at all and only jot down anecdotal descriptions and such, like I talked about in the previous video about the woman who could write descriptively, but she didn't have any plot or bigger story. It was just like, oh, I went to a club and I saw these dancers and I wanted to describe them. Okay, but they have to do more. This is a writing class. There's supposed to be at least a short story surrounding these people, their history, how they met, why they met, did they just meet right now? Again, those forks in the road, not just here they are, here's what happened, and in a vacuum, And then others, like in my poetry classes, who have sort of an outdated Hallmark card approach to rhyming poetry only, and I'm not saying all poetry doesn't need to rhyme and be free verse, and not all rhyming poetry is automatically bad. But are you writing limericks? Are you only writing haiku? And you're not Japanese, or you're writing English style haiku, that kind of thing. That's a pretty narrow category of people who are not typically writing expecting to get published. Okay, they're writing for their own pleasure, and what that pleasure is not the same kind of pleasure that people who want to write long form things enjoy. Okay. So in the next segment, I don't know how many non-revision types get published. Now, this is the opposite end of that spectrum. This is people who do write long form, but they write it all stream of conscious mostly and think everything they do is, again, brilliant. It never, ever needs any revision. So if that's the goal, to get a non-revised work published, he was saying that, many do. Well, I don't know how many. I can think of like 2, Burroughs and Kerouac. Obviously Kerouac supposedly got this leeway of not having to revise his stuff after he was already established with 2 published books, one of which was a cultural phenom, the other one which was not. So if On the Road didn't sell in droves and Town in the City was his only book, Dharma Bums would have read a lot more like Town in the City if it ever got published at all, is my point. Subterraneans, that probably shouldn't have been published anyway. Okay, I talked about this in a previous video or 2, so you can go back and find those. Although one was more of a kind of a Kerouac book haul than a total literary criticism of his work, but still. And still with Kerouac, that was 70 years ago now or something. So we've had plenty of those authors come and go in the meantime. And again, I think you're in the lucky 2% if you can get an unrevised book published that is strictly off the cuff. And, unless you're one of those really Spartan writers who's very perfect the first time through, chances are it's not you. I think some things are harder to revise and remain the original, true original spirit of the thing. I agree. Youthful exuberance does count for something, and even some of my own work. Huxley said this about Brave New World too. Although he might have meant in a slightly different fashion. But that doesn't mean that anybody out there, no matter how much exuberance it has, that anybody really wants to buy it, even if they might read it in college as a favor or something. And again, those beta readers will usually actually recommend plenty of revision to your original vision, which happened to me, and I couldn't believe it. What do you mean? It was too much of this. Yeah, but that was the point. And it's like, yeah, but the point was overkill. I barely finished it. Oh. And the funny thing was he contradicts himself with this advice, because in his previous point, that was his previous point, was that if you cut too much, it can be too Spartan or whatever. I forget, but there was a joke in there somewhere before I went off on my own little aside. Okay, 3, I think the distinction here would be whether the thing is being submitted for publication and the publisher or editor or whoever is requesting or demanding further revision, then most wannabe authors actually putting this much work into the revision process. Okay, so here we had the over reviser, again, going back to the other video with the girl and the other video, this worry that you're revising too much, and that's why you're never submitting it. Again, I would say you fall into a very narrow category, probably less than 2% of people who really do that much serious revision. The question would be whether or not they're doing harmful revision, again, back to point 1, or if they're just realizing. Now, in my case, that I keep kind of hinting at and not totally going into in videos, because it's a long tangent to go into the whole thing. I do this on purpose, though, because, again, I do the kitchen sink draft, where it's way too long, and there's all these tangents, and there's all this junk, and then I poach them out for other projects. And that helps revise this. But then these other projects don't necessarily get the same amount of quality revision as the initial one, and this and this and this. But they're always in kind of a constant state of revision, because I'm working on them at the same time. So it slows the whole process down a bit, because I'm constantly having to remember where I wanted to use this thing and finding it in that thing, instead of just putting it in a separate file and marking it for later, possible for this. I'm always going through and trying to figure out exactly where it should fit into this other thing. Okay. But again, that's technically and still the outline part of the writing book, because I'm not writing the new book. I'm just marrying these chunks. So apart from editing these chunks in a logical order, I'm not editing the chunks in terms of the granular writing, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's time consuming to do it that way, but then all this pre-work is kind of already done, because I could, like I said, I could go back and make a reverse outline, but I haven't made really a first outline, because I don't have to, because I have all these chunks that just sort of fit together. So we'll see. If you work like that, then yes, you're going to find it frustrating. It's going to take a long time, but the end result is you might have 2 finished books around the same time, or even 3, whereas the first person is still revising draft 3 of their first book. So that revised draft might be more ready for publication than my 2 drafts. So you can weigh that how you want. But if I end up with 2 or 3 drafts that still need revision, they still need revision. But I have a lot more ready to revise. So yeah, it depends on how you work. And like I said, I'm more of a seat of the pantser, so it suits me because I might want to change a bunch of stuff when I get to these forks in the road. Maybe not so much in source number 1, but when I get to source 2 and 3, definitely way more leeway. I can drop entire storylines. I can throw away entire characters. I can change a name, and all of a sudden all this dialogue became that guy instead of that guy. Sometimes that helps. Sometimes that hurts. Mostly it helps because it's like, oh, this chick sounds exactly like this chick. Okay, blammo. Now in this book, they're both the same chick. Now I have 3/4 of her dialogue done. You know, that kind of thing. Whereas in this book, it was not bad, but it was clunky, unwieldy. It acted way too much extra. We already know what she's like. We don't need this much more, that kind of thing. So I lost my place. Okay, this much work into the revision process, in which case they probably overthought their planning stage, which, again, arguably I don't do enough of. And they never started writing the thing in the first place, as you said in the beginning. Or is this just a case, as I criticized in the last video, of him just projecting again his own personal quirks or insecurities or whatever, which seems like the common issue with some of the points in his videos so far. And that is a real thing that I try not to do. If I tell you a thing, it's a thing I've done. It's not a thing I believe maybe you have done. Maybe it's a thing you want to try, or maybe it's a thing you want to avoid. But I'm not telling you that the reason you're having these problems is because you're doing this, because I don't know if that's why you're having problems. That's presumptuous. Don't do that. As an author, you can do that with your characters and put them anywhere you want and play with them like Greek chessboard from, you know, Clash of the Titans or whatever. But in terms of making YouTube videos that are useful and helpful, I am definitely not trying to project my issues onto you. You might have a totally different working style that's way better than mine, and that's fine. And maybe in the comments you'll tell me why I'm doing it wrong. But I'm mostly not interested in that discussion, obviously, for the point of this video either, because I don't think you're teaching old dogs new tricks so much. That's why these videos are typically addressed to newer, younger writers than anybody established who's not going to watch this anyway. Okay. I've already published 3 books. Why would I need to watch your video, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe if you've experienced white writer's block, or if you currently are, then maybe you're here for that reason. Maybe some of this will be useful too. You never know. Okay, so then the last point, or the second to the last point, I guess, before we repeat ourselves a bit, maybe, is passion. Yes, again, the common one of the faults that I find mostly, especially in younger writers, is that they fall in love with all their own words, and will likely be their biggest downfall, more than a tendency to over revise and overwork every scene, which I also think in these videos, when they say scene, they mean chapter. But in the typical vernacular, although nowadays, again, since Kerouac and Burroughs and whoever, there's a lot more of those pesky authors whom don't divide things up and give us a break much. You know, it's all one long paragraph for 200 pages. Yay. I don't know about you, but I'm a guy who likes to bookmark and put the thing down when I need a break. The concern in a previous video by one of them, or multiple of them, was, you know, how to keep the reader keeping going through the next chapter. But I think your chapters do still have to end, because sometimes we do have to go to bed and get up in the morning, you know, or that kind of thing. Or as annoyingly happens in places like a dentist's office, when you're like that half a page before the end of the chapter and they call you in, and you actually have to go back and kind of reread the thing instead of being ready to go on to the next chapter. Like, no, I was almost done with this stupid chapter, but I keep getting interrupted by the telephone or the receptionist or whoever. But that's a separate, that's a reader issue, not a writer issue, obviously. As a writer, again, you want the chapter to not always be open-ended. You want the chapter to pretty much contain the necessary information before we go on to the next chapter. And so usually when I'm starting a book, it's one of two things. It's either that long first chapter where we throw in all our ideas, or it's those really short chapters before we kind of know what we're doing, before we start to get into the longer scenes. And sometimes I would argue that those shorter chapters need to be longer, but not always. Depends on the book. Depends on the style of the book, yada, yada, yada. Again, a lot of those intro chapters, it's because we're trying to show or convey action rather than give a bunch of backstory, whereas I'm kind of a backstory, I don't know, reliant or whatever, or adherent, I guess. So I want it in there kind of in the first 2 or 3 chapters, usually, like, why do I care about this person? You know, apart from, oh, he solved this action issue or whatever. I think some of that belongs in there. Now, the example I like to go to a lot is, you know, Indiana Jones, where the backstory is not really given so much. Well, there's the backstory with Marion, but the other backstory with the father isn't given until like the 3rd movie, really, right? Where it becomes the beginning of the 3rd movie. And you can argue whether or not the beginning part of the 3rd movie holds up, or if you know, usually if I'm watching Last Crusade, it's because it's on TV and that part's already happened. I've almost never seen the movie all the way from the beginning, you know, in recent years. Like one time I remember I turned it on, I was like shocked. I was like, oh yeah, there's a whole River Phoenix part that I had like literally kind of entirely forgotten about, you know. That kind of thing. But if we had started Raiders of the Lost Ark with that story of how he got his hat and all that, I think we would have seen it as a lot more corny and a lot less effective. So seeing it in the beginning of the 3rd movie was like, oh, new stuff, neat, we didn't know this. Whereas, you know, again, Temple of the Doom, we would have rather had that movie instead of the middle movie, but the middle movie had some information, blah, blah, blah. So we were still familiar with Indy. We were still on board. We still wanted a good Indy story. The movie hadn't totally turned us off to the franchise or the character, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so coming back here, cutting the wrong stuff or too much. I said, now in the previous video, I talked about this at length when I argued with that other guy. This was my original comment for his video that I didn't actually comment on his video because I saved it for this video. When I said that writers need to cut a lot of stuff in their revision, it's not the wrong stuff I want you to cut. I had said use verbs instead of adverbs. So I wasn't saying taking out all colorful description from your book to make your book read faster. Okay. I was saying make your description better in less time, which is not advice that I invented, as I said. That's old advice that still rings true. So if you're misunderstanding that advice and making your writing worse in your first revision or second revision, that's on you, not me or them or whoever came up with that adverbs type of content. The other issue being never getting started wanting to become a writer. Yes, this was a girl I actually met once. I knew a guy, didn't know him very well, but he had read some of my stuff that I had loaned to a friend, I guess, and he didn't seem to like me all that much, but then all of a sudden he comes at me and starts talking about how much he respects me as a writer. And so that was kind of, you know, an odd exchange. He's like, oh, I didn't know you had read any of my writing. He's like, oh yeah, no, man, it's good. You know, I was like, okay, well, that's cool. And he said, no, this is my girlfriend and she wants to be a writer and she keeps not doing anything. And I'm trying to convince her to, you know, do it. Can you give her a pep talk? And I said, well, of course, you know, why wouldn't I, you know? And so I went over to the girl and I tried to give her the pep talk. And she was like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm like gonna do it later when I have more stuff to write about." And it was like, well, this comes up in a lot of videos, how if you don't exercise the muscle, it won't be there when you need it. So I do agree that younger writers don't typically have as much to say, especially like comedians, where you see a 16-year-old comedian and, oh my God, I don't care about your homework like at all, or the puppy love that you is just you chasing around some girl who doesn't even know you exist or whatever. But at least that twerp is going through the motions. If you're just sitting at home not doing anything, then no, you're not going to become a great writer immediately, instantaneously, the second you decide that you're finally wise enough to have something to say. Sorry, it's not going to work like that. As I keep saying, if you're not a seat of the pantser, fine, but even if you are or are not, getting that first draft down is more crucial than all this outlining and reverse outlining and revising and da 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 da. And I told her that, and she ignored me, and that's fine. Whatever. Less competition for us. The next thing was keeping it to yourself, not sharing. Don't think she fell into this category, although it's possible. A lot of these kind of diary poetry girls are like that. They're embarrassed, they're shy. Again, that's I don't know if it's a smaller category than the other categories I was saying earlier, but definitely not the ones I typically meet. Again, I wouldn't know they were writers if they didn't tell me they were writers. So could be an iceberg, don't know. But as I stated, like for me, it's kind of the opposite. Like, here's a guy who's read my writing, and I didn't even know he had read my writing, because I'm certainly not shy about having it like out there or whatever. Not my problem. So I'm not projecting. Again, so I don't know how common that is, but again, some people don't want to be published. They want to write their Hallmark card poetry. I guess that's fine. But if you're watching this because you secretly really do want to be published and you're just too shy, then yes, you need to overcome that. You need to get a thicker skin. You need to get at least beta readers, or if you think it's that good, query it out and see if it needs revision or not, even if you think it doesn't, as I'm trying to tie back all these previous points to this one point to make this totally relevant. And then we came back to too much revision versus revise the wrong things. I don't think we need to discuss that again. I think I just put that there to make sure that I covered it. And I believe we did cover it 2 or 3 times. And then passion, again, falling in love with your own words. Passion is baggage. Okay, this was a new point that came from another video. Again, just today, I think, from a different creator. Partly true, especially this might be those keep it to yourself people. In the other way, like, again, the passionate people who want to share everything because they think everything they do is brilliant is typically considered more passionate. But these other people, maybe the passion is kind of their secrecy or whatever. But the execution was the key point to that. You're being so passionate about it that, again, you don't think it ever needs revision. That may or may not be true. You think all your words are brilliant, and there might not be, blah, blah, blah. Like I said, I don't want to get too redundant on this. And I think you kind of get the gist. And this went on, okay, that was way more than 10 more minutes. It was like 15 more minutes, but I don't think all worthless content. So long lecture today, but you can watch it in 2 or 3 parts. And as always, if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments. I don't know who's going to make it to the end of this, but hopefully some of you who actually need to hear this actually do, because again, I don't think I'm talking just to hear myself talk when I reply to these other videos where they are talking and still making way shorter videos somehow. But that's okay. Like I said, leave the comments and I'll attempt to clarify if necessary, which is a form of revision.